If the Somme taught the world the price of attrition, Passchendaele taught them the cost of obsession. It was a battle where ambition drowned in the very ground it fought over. This is the story of the British offensive of 1917. A relentless drive for a tactical advantage, the capture of a simple ridge that turned into a 5-month nightmare of rain, shelling, and mud so thick it swallowed men whole. Today, we sink deep into the brutal reality of the Third Battle of Ypres. This is the Battle of Passchendaele. In the autumn of 1917, in a small corner of western Belgium, the British Army fought one of the most harrowing battles in human history. The place was called Ypres, a medieval cloth town that had already witnessed 3 years of warfare. And the battle that unfolded there through the late summer and autumn would come to symbolize everything about the Great War that soldiers and civilians alike found most terrible: the mud, the rain, the endless casualties, and the seeming futility of it all. This is the story of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, a battle fought not just against the German army, but against the elements themselves. To understand Passchendaele, one must first understand the place where it was fought, the Ypres Salient. A salient is a bulge in the front line, a section where the defensive position projects forward into enemy territory. The Ypres Salient was such a place, a curve in the British line that pushed eastward from the town of Ypres toward the low ridges that the Germans held. This salient had existed since the autumn of 1914, when German forces had tried and failed to capture Ypres during the First Battle of Ypres. The British and their allies had held the town, but at tremendous cost. The Germans occupied the high ground in a semicircle around Ypres, the ridges to the east and south, and from these heights, their artillery could observe and shell nearly every position in the salient. For 3 years, British soldiers had lived and died in this exposed position. The salient was only about 5 miles deep and perhaps 10 miles wide at its base, yet it consumed divisions. Men who served there spoke of it with a mixture of dread and dark humor. The Germans could shell you from 3 sides. Communication trenches were under constant observation. Even rear areas were dangerous. Ypres itself was gradually being reduced to rubble by German artillery fire. By the spring of 1917, the strategic situation on the Western Front had grown increasingly difficult for the Allies. The French army, exhausted by 3 years of war and traumatized by the disastrous Nivelle offensive earlier that year, had suffered widespread mutinies. Entire divisions had refused orders to attack. The French remained capable of defense, but their offensive power was spent for the moment. Russia, too, was collapsing. The revolution in March had toppled the Tsar, and though the provisional government promised to continue fighting, it was clear that Russia's commitment to the war was weakening. By summer, Russian offensive capability had effectively ceased. If Russia left the war entirely, Germany would be free to transfer hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the West. The burden of continuing the offensive war in the West, therefore, fell primarily to Britain and the British Empire forces. And the man who bore responsibility for British strategy was Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force. Haig believed that an offensive from the Ypres salient offered strategic opportunities that could not be ignored. First, if British forces could break through the German lines and advance to the northeast, they could threaten the Belgian coast, where the Germans had established submarine bases. These U-boat bases were inflicting terrible losses on Allied shipping, threatening Britain's ability to sustain the war. Capturing or threatening these bases might force Germany to redeploy naval assets and reduce the U-boat threat. Second, an offensive at Ypres would relieve pressure on the French army, allowing it time to recover from the mutinies and rebuild morale. If the British could draw German reserves to Flanders, the French sectors would remain quiet, giving French commanders time to address the crisis in their ranks. And third, Haig believed, despite all evidence to the contrary from previous battles, that a breakthrough was still possible. If sufficient force were applied, if the artillery preparation were adequate, if the tactics were sound, then perhaps the German lines could be ruptured and mobile warfare restored. Perhaps this time would be different. The offensive was assigned to General Sir Hubert Gough and his Fifth Army. Gough was younger than many British commanders, aggressive and confident. He believed in the offensive spirit, in seizing opportunities, in pushing forward regardless of obstacles. Haig trusted him to deliver the breakthrough that had eluded every previous offensive on the Western Front. But there were concerns, even before the battle began. Some senior officers worried about the timing. Some questioned whether the strategic objectives were achievable. And some pointed to a factor that would prove more decisive than any strategic planning: the weather. The region around Ypres was low-lying, with heavy clay soil and a high water table. For centuries, the Flemish farmers had maintained an intricate system of drainage ditches and canals to keep the fields from flooding. During the dry summer months, the ground was firm. But in autumn and winter, when the rains came, the land became waterlogged, the fields turned to mud, and movement became difficult. The Third Battle of Ypres was scheduled to begin in late July. The hope was that it would achieve its objectives before the autumn rains arrived. But hope, as the soldiers would soon discover, was not a strategy. And the weather, indifferent to human plans, would have the final word. Before any offensive on the Western Front could begin, there came the artillery bombardment. This was the established doctrine by 1917, that massed artillery fire, if sustained and concentrated enough, could destroy enemy defenses, cut barbed wire, and suppress the defenders sufficiently that the infantry could advance with acceptable casualties. The bombardment that preceded the Third Battle of Ypres was among the largest yet attempted. Over 3,000 guns were assembled along the British front: howitzers, field guns, heavy siege artillery. They were positioned in carefully surveyed locations, supplied by an endless stream of shells brought forward by rail and truck and horse-drawn limber. The preliminary bombardment began on July 18, 1917, and continued for 10 days. 10 full days of shelling, far longer than the week-long bombardment that had preceded the Somme offensive the previous year. In those 10 days, British artillery fired over 4 million shells at German positions. The noise was constant, overwhelming. Soldiers miles from the front spoke of the ground trembling beneath their feet, of the sky flickering with muzzle flashes even at night, of the sound becoming so pervasive that it ceased to be a sound at all and became simply an atmospheric condition, like heat or cold. The bombardment was intended to accomplish multiple objectives. It would destroy German pillboxes, the reinforced concrete bunkers that dotted the German defensive system. It would cut the barbed wire that protected German positions. It would kill or demoralize German defenders, forcing them to shelter deep underground. And it would suppress German artillery, preventing it from firing on the British infantry when they attacked. But the bombardment had an unintended consequence, one that would prove more significant than all its intended effects combined. Those 4 million shells did not simply destroy German positions. They destroyed the land itself. Every shell that struck the ground created a crater. Some were small, a few feet across. Others, from heavy howitzers, were enormous, 20 or 30 feet in diameter, 10 feet deep. And when 4 million shells fell on a relatively small area over the course of 10 days, the entire landscape was torn apart. More critically, the bombardment destroyed the drainage system. The centuries-old network of ditches and canals that kept the Flemish lowlands from flooding was obliterated. Water that would normally have drained away now had nowhere to go. It pooled in shell craters. It seeped into trenches. It saturated the heavy clay soil, turning it into a thick, adhesive mud that clung to everything and made movement exhausting. And then, just as the bombardment ended and the infantry prepared to attack, the weather changed. On July 31, 1917, the day the offensive began, it started to rain. Not a passing shower, but steady, persistent rain that fell throughout the day and into the night. And it continued. August 1917 would prove to be one of the wettest months in Belgian history. Rain fell almost continuously. The sky remained grey and overcast. The temperature dropped. And the battlefield, already churned by millions of shells, became a quagmire. The mud at Passchendaele was unlike anything soldiers had experienced before, even veterans of the Somme. It was not just wet earth. It was a thick, viscous substance that could swallow a man whole. Soldiers who strayed from the duckboard paths, narrow wooden walkways laid across the mud, could sink up to their waists, their chests, unable to extricate themselves without help. Men drowned in shell craters filled with water and mud. Mules and horses disappeared entirely, swallowed by the liquid earth. Artillery pieces sank into the ground and could not be moved forward. The wounded faced a particularly terrible fate. A man hit by shell fragments or machine gun fire would fall, often into a shell crater or into the mud. If he could not move himself, he would slowly sink. Stretcher-bearers tried to reach the wounded, but moving through the mud with a loaded stretcher required 4 or even 6 men and took hours. Many wounded men, unable to be reached in time, drowned in the mud before they could be rescued. Their bodies simply vanished, claimed by the earth. The official casualty statistics from Passchendaele record the killed and wounded, but they cannot account for the men who were listed as missing, those who disappeared into the mud and were never found. After the war, when the battlefields were cleared and cemeteries established, bodies continued to be discovered for years, sometimes decades. Many were never identified. They remain in their graves marked only as a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. The rain and mud had another effect, one that commanders had not fully anticipated. They made artillery support far less effective. Guns that should have been moved forward to support the infantry advance became bogged down in the mud. Shells that landed in the saturated ground often failed to explode, simply burying themselves in the mud without detonating. Observation for artillery became nearly impossible. The rain and overcast skies prevented aerial reconnaissance, and ground observers could see only a few hundred yards not on July 31st, but 2 months earlier, when they preliminary operations designed to secure the southern flank across terrain that was worse than anticipated. This was the Battle of Messines, against offensives that had survived the bombardment better than expected, and it stands as one of the stage was set for a British tactical successes of the entire war that would consume hundreds of thousands of casualties. Was a low-rise that would become synonymous that the Germans had held since 1914. The Third Battle of Ypres, they could observe and shelled British by the name of a small village on a low ridge. Capturing Messines was essential before the main offensive could begin. The operation was entrusted to General Herbert Plumer, commander of the Second Army, a methodical, careful commander who believed in thorough preparation and limited objectives. Plumer's plan was remarkable in its ingenuity. For over a year, British and Commonwealth tunneling companies had been digging deep mines under the German positions on Messines Ridge. These tunnels extended hundreds of yards, running beneath no man's land and under the German trenches. At the end of each tunnel, enormous chambers were excavated and packed with high explosives. In total, nearly 1 million pounds of explosives distributed among 19 mines. At 3:10 a.m. on June 7th, after a 17-day artillery bombardment, 17 of the 19 mines were detonated simultaneously. The explosions were among the largest non-nuclear man-made explosions in history up to that point. The sound was heard in London, over 100 miles away. The ground shook as far as Dublin. Entire sections of the German front line were obliterated. Trenches, dugouts, pillboxes, and their occupants simply ceased to exist, vaporized or buried by the blasts. British and Anzac infantry attacked immediately after the explosions, advancing behind a creeping barrage. The German defenders, those who had survived the mines and bombardment, were stunned, disoriented, unable to mount effective resistance. By the end of the day, the entire Messines Ridge was in British hands. German casualties numbered around 25,000, including 7,000 taken prisoner. British and Anzac casualties were relatively light by Western Front standards, around 17,000. The success at Messines raised hopes that the main offensive, when it came 6 weeks later, might achieve similar results. But Messines had succeeded because it was a limited operation with achievable objectives, thoroughly prepared, executed by an experienced commander. The main offensive would be different in scale and ambition, and, as events would prove, in outcome. On July 31, 1917, at 3:50 a.m., the main infantry assault of the Third Battle of Ypres began. Along a front of approximately 15 miles, divisions of General Gough's Fifth Army and part of Plumer's Second Army went over the top and advanced toward the German lines through the rain and pre-dawn darkness. The initial objectives were the German first and second defensive lines, and the villages and strong points they contained, Pilcum Ridge, St. Julian, Friesenberg. If these could be captured quickly, the advance could continue to the higher ground beyond, threatening the German defensive system in depth and potentially opening the way for a breakthrough. In some sectors, the attack achieved its objectives. On the northern part of the front, where French forces were also attacking in support, progress was good. Villages were captured, German positions overrun, prisoners taken. On the left of the British attack, progress was also satisfactory, with advances of over 2 miles achieved by some divisions. But on the center and right of the attack, where General Gough's Fifth Army bore the main effort, the results were mixed at best. The rain had turned the ground into a morass. Units became disorganized trying to navigate through the mud and shell craters. The artillery support, which should have suppressed German defenses, was less effective than planned because observation was poor and many guns were unable to move forward to continue supporting the advance. And the Germans, though they had suffered heavily from the preliminary bombardment, had not been destroyed. Their defensive doctrine had evolved since the summer. Rather than packing men into frontline trenches where they could be killed by artillery, the Germans now defended in depth, with scattered strong points, pillboxes, from which machine gun fire could sweep the approaches, supported by infantry and shell holes and small positions that were difficult for artillery to target effectively. These pillboxes were formidable structures. Built of reinforced concrete, often with walls several feet thick, they were proof against anything but a direct hit from heavy artillery. Inside, a machine gun crew could shelter during a bombardment and then emerge to man their weapon when the infantry attack came. A single pillbox, well positioned, could hold up an entire battalion. British infantry attacking across the mud and through the rain would advance until they came within range of a pillbox, and then the machine guns would open fire. The attackers would go to ground, pinned down, unable to advance without prohibitive casualties. Eventually, some would work their way close enough to attack the pillbox with grenades or rifle fire, or to call up supporting weapons. But this took time and casualties, and it meant that the advance proceeded far more slowly than planned. By the end of July 31st, British forces had advanced in most sectors, but nowhere had they achieved all their objectives. The Germans still held key positions. The weather remained terrible, and the casualties had been heavy, approximately 32,000 on the first day alone. General Gough wanted to continue attacking, to maintain momentum, to push through the German defenses before they could be reinforced. But Haig, observing the conditions and the results, began to reconsider. Perhaps Gough's aggressive approach was not suitable for this battlefield. Perhaps what was needed was the methodical, careful approach of General Plumer: limited objectives, thorough preparation, step-by-step progress. In late August, Haig shifted the main effort from Gough's Fifth Army to Plumer's Second Army. Plumer would continue the offensive, but in a different manner. Rather than attempting breakthrough, he would focus on attrition, capturing limited objectives, inflicting maximum casualties on the Germans with minimum British losses, gradually wearing down the German defensive capacity until it collapsed. Plumer's first operation under this new approach was the Battle of the Menin Road Ridge, launched on September 20, 1917. The attack was preceded by a massive but brief artillery bombardment, carefully coordinated with the infantry advance. The objectives were limited, a maximum advance of about 1,500 yards. Fresh divisions were used. The weather, for once, was dry. The Battle of Menin Road Ridge was a tactical success. British and Australian troops captured their objectives, inflicted heavy casualties on German counterattacks, and held the ground they had taken. Casualties were still significant, around 21,000 British, but German losses were higher, perhaps 30,000, and critically, the British had advanced and held ground. Plumer launched similar operations in the following weeks. The Battle of Polygon would on September 26, the Battle of Broodseinde on October 4. Each achieved limited success. Each advanced the British line forward a mile or two. Each cost tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. And each brought British forces closer to the low ridge that dominated the eastern horizon, the ridge crowned by the ruined village of Passchendaele. But the weather was deteriorating again. October brought renewed rain. The mud returned, worse than before, and the casualties continued to mount. The battle that had begun in July showed no sign of ending. And ahead, through the rain and mud, lay the final objective, the Passchendaele Ridge, where the hardest fighting was still to come. By October 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres had been raging for 3 months. British, Anzac, and South African forces had fought through rain and mud, advancing yard by yard toward the low ridge that rose east of Ypres. Tens of thousands had been killed or wounded. Entire divisions had been ground down and withdrawn to rest and refit. And still the offensive continued. The objective now was clear, the Passchendaele Ridge. This low rise, barely a ridge at all by any conventional geographic standard, had become strategically important because it was the only significant high ground in the area. Whoever held it could observe the surrounding terrain and direct artillery fire. If the British could capture it, they would finally have gained the commanding ground they sought. If they failed, the entire offensive would end with nothing to show for the terrible sacrifice but a few miles of muddy, shell-torn wasteland. But taking Passchendaele would require fresh troops, units that had not been exhausted by months of fighting in the mud. And so, in early October, Haig turned to a force that had earned a reputation as among the finest assault troops in the British Empire, the Canadian Corps. The Canadian Corps had served on the Western Front since 1915. They had fought at Ypres in 1915, where they had held the line against the first German gas attack. They had fought at the Somme in 1916. They had captured Vimy Ridge in April 1917 in a brilliantly executed operation that had become a defining moment in Canadian national identity. They were experienced, well-trained, and led by an exceptionally capable commander, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie. Currie was a Canadian citizen soldier who had become one of the finest commanders of the war. He believed in thorough preparation, in realistic training, in ensuring that his men had the best possible support before committing them to battle. He was also willing to speak candidly to his superiors, a trait that was not always appreciated but which earned him the respect of his soldiers. When Currie was ordered to prepare the Canadian Corps for the assault on Passchendaele, he traveled to the battlefield to assess the situation personally. What he saw appalled him. The mud was even worse than he had been told. The approaches to the front line were few and badly exposed to German artillery fire. Casualties among the troops moving up to the line were heavy even before they entered combat. The entire operation, in Currie's professional opinion, would cost at least 16,000 Canadian casualties for an objective of dubious strategic value. Currie objected to the operation. He argued that the casualties would be excessive, that the strategic value did not justify the cost. But he was overruled. The decision to take Passchendaele had been made. The Canadian Corps would make the attack. Currie accepted the order, but he insisted on doing it his way. There would be no rushed assault. The Canadians would attack only when they were ready, when the preparations were complete, when the logistics were in place to support them. Roads would be built or repaired to allow movement of supplies and artillery forward. Casualty clearing stations would be established. Duckboard paths would be laid across the mud to allow troops to move without exhausting themselves before they even reached the front line. The first Canadian attack on Passchendaele was launched on October 26, 1917. It was preceded by a heavy but brief artillery bombardment. The infantry advanced through rain and mud toward the ruined village of Passchendaele, still held by German forces. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards. Casualties were heavy, over 2,600 on the first day. The Canadians gained some ground but fell short of their final objectives. The fighting at Passchendaele was unlike anything even these experienced soldiers had encountered before. The mud was so deep that wounded men could not be evacuated from the battlefield for hours, sometimes days. Stretcher bearers, moving through the mud with a wounded man, often took 6, 8, even 12 hours to reach a casualty clearing station that in normal conditions would have been 30 minutes away. Men fought in shell craters filled with water, using the crater lips as cover from enemy fire. Rifles became clogged with mud and ceased to function. Machine guns had to be continuously cleaned or they would jam. Soldiers carried extra clothing because what they wore became so saturated with mud that it had to be discarded. The simple act of walking required enormous effort. Each step in the thick mud exhausted a man's strength. And always, there was the artillery. German guns, firing from positions beyond the ridge, shelled the Canadian positions continuously. British guns replied, but the mud made counter-battery fire less effective. Shells fell randomly across the battlefield, killing friend and foe alike. A direct hit from a heavy shell could obliterate an entire squad, leaving nothing behind but a crater. Men simply vanished, their bodies destroyed beyond recognition or recovery. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. Soldiers who survived the fighting often emerged mentally shattered, unable to function. Shell shock, what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder, was epidemic. Men who had shown courage in previous battles broke down entirely at Passchendaele. The combination of the mud, the rain, the continuous shellfire, the appalling casualties, and the seeming futility of the whole enterprise broke something in many men's minds. The Canadian attacks continued through early November. On October 30th, a second attack gained more ground. On November 6th, a third attack brought Canadian forces to the outskirts of Passchendaele village itself. And finally, on November 10, 1917, after 2 weeks of continuous fighting, Canadian soldiers entered what remained of Passchendaele, a few ruined buildings, some shell craters, and mud. Nothing more. The village, if it could still be called that, was captured. The ridge was in British hands. The objective of the Third Battle of Ypres had been achieved. General Currie's prediction of casualties had been grimly accurate. The Canadian Corps suffered approximately 15,600 casualties in the battle for Passchendaele, almost exactly what Currie had estimated. For a village that no longer existed, for a ridge that would be abandoned to the Germans just 5 months later during their spring offensive in 1918, 15,000 Canadian soldiers had been killed or wounded. And with the capture of Passchendaele, Haig called a halt to the offensive. Winter was closing in. The battlefield was utterly impassable. Further operations were impossible. The Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, was over. Over, but at what cost? And what had been achieved? These were questions that would be debated for decades to come, questions that remain unresolved even now, over a century later. When the Third Battle of Ypres ended in November 1917, the front line had moved approximately 5 miles eastward from where it had been in July. 5 miles gained in over 4 months of fighting. And for those 5 miles, the British Empire forces had suffered approximately 275,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. French casualties added another 8,500. German casualties are harder to calculate precisely, but estimates range from 200,000 to 400,000. Combined, somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 casualties. For 5 miles of mud. The strategic objectives of the offensive, to break through the German lines, to threaten the Belgian coast, to capture the submarine bases, were not achieved. The breakthrough never came. The Belgian ports remained in German hands. The U-boats continued to operate from their bases, and the submarine campaign against Allied shipping continued. The secondary objective, to relieve pressure on the French army and allow it to recover from the mutinies, was achieved, though at a cost far higher than anyone had anticipated. The Germans did commit reserves to Flanders, reserves that might otherwise have been used to attack the weakened French. In this sense, the battle served its purpose. But whether the cost was proportionate to the gain remains one of the most contentious questions in military history. General Haig defended the offensive for the rest of his life. He argued that the battle had worn down German reserves, that it had inflicted unsustainable casualties on the German army, that it had set the conditions for the eventual Allied victory in 1918. And there is some truth to this. The German army that emerged from Passchendaele was weakened, its reserves depleted, its defensive doctrine evolved in ways that would make it vulnerable to the new Allied tactics of 1918. But the critics, and there were many, pointed to the appalling casualties, the minimal territorial gains, the failure to achieve the stated objectives, and the apparent disconnect between the conditions on the battlefield and the decisions being made at headquarters. How could commanders continue to order attacks when the battlefield was so obviously impassable? How could the offensive be continued month after month as casualties mounted and progress stalled? For the soldiers who fought at Passchendaele, there was no debate. They knew what they had experienced. They had lived in the mud, fought in the rain, seen their friends die in the shell craters and drown in the mire. They had done everything asked of them, shown courage beyond measure, endured conditions that should have broken any human being. And they had taken Passchendaele. But what they had taken was nothing, a wasteland, a moonscape of mud and water and death. There was no glory at Passchendaele. There was only survival. And even survival came at a cost. The men who emerged from that battlefield were changed, marked by what they had witnessed and endured. After the war, Passchendaele became a symbol. While the Somme represented futility and the first day's catastrophic casualties, Passchendaele represented something different. The mud, the grinding attrition, the sense of endurance pushed to its absolute limit. When veterans spoke of the worst conditions they had experienced, they spoke of Passchendaele. When poets and writers sought to convey the horror of the Western Front, they invoked Passchendaele. The poet Siegfried Sassoon, who had fought on the Western Front and would become one of the most important war poets, wrote of soldiers dying in hell at Passchendaele. The name itself became shorthand for everything that was worst about the war: the mud, the rain, the casualties, the futility. Today, the battlefield of Passchendaele is quiet. The land has been reclaimed, the mud drained, the farms restored. The village of Passchendaele, now called Passchendaele, was rebuilt after the war. It is a small, peaceful place, giving no hint of what occurred there over a century ago. But the cemeteries remain. Tyne-Cot Cemetery, the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the world, contains the graves of nearly 12,000 soldiers who died in the Ypres Salient. The memorial wall at Tyne-Cot bears the names of nearly 35,000 soldiers who died in the salient and have no known grave, men who disappeared into the mud and were never found. Other cemeteries dot the landscape, small, carefully maintained, marking the places where soldiers of many nations fell. British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, German. They lie there still, in the ground they fought over, in the mud that claimed so many of their comrades. The headstones stand in neat rows, white against the green grass, each marking a life cut short, a family's grief, a story ended too soon. Every evening at 8 o'clock, under the Menin Gate in Ypres, a memorial arch that bears the names of 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the salient and have no known grave, buglers from the local fire brigade sound the last post. This ceremony has been performed almost every night since 1928, interrupted only by the German occupation during the Second World War. It is a ritual of remembrance, a promise that these men will not be forgotten. The Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, stands in history as one of the defining engagements of the First World War. Not because it changed the course of the war, not because it achieved great strategic victories, but because it revealed the true nature of industrial warfare at its most terrible. It showed what human beings could endure, and what they could inflict upon each other. It demonstrated both the heights of courage and the depths of suffering. The soldiers who fought there, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, French, and German, did their duty as they understood it. They fought in conditions that defy imagination. They showed bravery that deserves to be remembered. And they left behind a legacy that reminds us, even now, of the cost of war. 5 miles of mud. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. A village that no longer existed. A ridge that would be surrendered months later. And yet, in the memories of those who fought there, in the cemeteries that mark the battlefield, in the names carved on memorial walls, Passchendaele endures, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a testament to what was endured in that corner of Belgium in the autumn of 1917. The Battle of Passchendaele. The Third Battle of Ypres. July 31st through November 10th, 1917. A battle fought in the mud, against the rain, for a ridge that barely rose above the surrounding plain. A battle that cost more than 500,000 casualties. A battle that achieved its limited objectives at a price that still haunts us. A battle that must be remembered, so that we might understand what war truly means and what it costs. Rest in peace. When the final offensive ground to a halt in November 1917, the British and Canadian forces had captured the infamous Passchendaele Ridge. But the victory felt hollow. The cost was staggering. Over 400,000 Allied casualties and over 250,000 German casualties, all for a few miles of terrain that would be retaken by the Germans a few months later. Passchendaele became the definitive example of the High Command's fatal disregard for the lives of their men. It remains a bleak, powerful symbol of the horrific conditions and strategic miscalculations that defined the Great War. If you want to understand the monumental struggles and the terrible lessons forged on the battlefields of history, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you view the capture of Passchendaele Ridge as a necessary strategic objective or an unforgivable military blunder? Thanks for watching.